When I was the executive director of the Society of Arts and Crafts in Boston, Chris won one of the SAC's prestigious artist awards, and we also included his work in a number of exhibitions over the years. I also serve on the board of Watershed Center for Ceramic Arts, which is a ceramic artist residency program in Maine, and Chris is one of the founders. Gotta breathe, I was running around. I'm so pleased that we were able to bring Chris's retrospective exhibition, Masterworks in Clay, to AMOCA to share with the Southern California community. The exhibition was organized by independent curator Sherry Leedy, and it follows Chris's evolution as an artist. Chris has been a maker, a mentor, a father, a husband, a friend, a teacher, and a tile maker. He has worked in museum collections across the country and has won awards and grants from the Massachusetts Cultural Council to the NEA. I'll stop there and I'll let Chris tell you the rest of the story. Please join me in welcoming Chris Gustin.
Thank you very much. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I grew up in Los Angeles and left in 1970, moved back east, and I very rarely show on the West Coast. And I've shown at Frank Lloyd and I showed with Garth Clark for a number of years. So, but for the last about 15 years, I haven't shown in LA. So it's nice to be here and have this exhibition. And I want to thank Beth. She's the one that really got it out to AMOCA. And David Armstrong. And a very special thanks to both Gretchen Keyworth, who was the instigator of the idea for the exhibition, where she approached me in 2007. And then around 2009, we started working on it, and that's how long these things take. And especially thanks to Sherry Leedy, who curated it. And I had a fantastic relationship with her to put all the work together. And Sherry was going to be here, but she's having eye surgery this week, so she couldn't make it. So, let's see here. Okay, I call this talk Finding Form because it's really about a life of working in clay and trying to figure out who you are as an individual, who you are as a maker, who you are as an artist, as a father, as a friend, as a teacher, all these things. And clay is kind of the conduit for me to kind of understand the world I live in, politics, social situations, the whole deal. It all kind of centers around the act of making. I grew up, well, we'll start here. This is a perfect example of utility, if you will. Okay, this is a little piglet, and he's drinking a little cup of hot chocolate. Okay? And he cares less about what is holding that liquid. All he cares about that it's being held, and he has access to it. So this is an example of utility in its purest form. And we know it in kind of our world as this. This is the ultimate utilitarian object. It works on every level of need, but there's really not a lot of aesthetic qualities. So this is an example of utilitarian wear that we all experience. But you can take that utility and now you can begin to alter it. And you take an object that has no identity, meaning that millions of them are made and no one is different than the other. And all of a sudden you start to draw on it and you begin to individualize. And now function begins to come into it because with function comes discernment. It comes like choice. I like this one, I don't like that one. This interests me, this one doesn't. And so utility now marries function and you get an individuality from an object. But what if you take this further and you say, okay, this is to hold liquid, but I'm going to throw that assumption out. I'm going to take this cup and I'm going to ask another question. I'm going to ask, what else could it hold? And that question is answered by Tara Donovan. So these are styrofoam cups that are now containers of light rather than liquid. So the same object exists in numerous worlds: utilitarian, functional, abstraction, sculpture. Okay, this search has been what I've been kind of struggling with as an artist over the last 40 years. The search, starting in utility as a functional potter, and then moving towards abstraction and sculpture.
and trying to figure out those questions along the way. Now, I grew up in Los Angeles. I live in South Dartmouth, Massachusetts, near Cape Cod. And my studio is right where that red X is on the image on the right, I think. And I bought an old chicken farm a number of years ago in the early 80s and renovated it. And it's about an 8,000 square foot building, and about 5,000 square feet of it is studio space. And out of that, I make my work. And it's been kind of a long move, okay? 40 years covers a lot of time and a lot of territory. And it all started, 20 miles from here on the coast. So I grew up in Los Angeles, Westwood. Used to go hunting at UCLA before Poly Pavilion was built and all that when I was just a little kid in the 50s. Surfed Malibu. And I'm going to talk about surfing a little later because surfing is really an interesting thing. It connects your body to the rhythm of energy. And we're going to talk about that in terms of the work. These are my parents, Jay and Yvonne Gustin, and they were manufacturers and distributors of giftware. And they had a facility down at Merchandise Mart, right off the 10, down in downtown Los Angeles. And previous down on Olive Street in LA. And I grew up amongst kind of commercial giftware. And they owned a couple factories, or were part owners in a couple factories, and I worked in them. And so I was being trained to take over and run factories from the very earliest age. And they made things like this, okay, tureens and batter bowls and all kinds of decorative objects. So this was, I ran a factory from the time I was about 18 to the time I was 21 maybe. And then I decided I didn't want that life. And my brother talked me into making a move. One of the factories that they ran was down in Watts. And Simon Rodea would borrow the trash from it and build these things from it. So there's this wonderful history of, again, that sense of utility going, and this is the kind of the irony of it all, the utilitarian object that's made for commercial giftware ending up in these amazing sculptures, So it's in the family history, that this was kind of the language we were trying to figure out. So I decided to go to Kansas City Art Institute. And this lecture is going to talk about my work over decades. So it's like every decade I seem to make a different move. And I'm just on that cusp right now, and I'll talk about that at the end. And the first part of it was pots. It was like learning what's a functional pot? What does utility mean? And so this is the early 70s, 20-year-old kids trying to make teapots, and they've never drank a cup of tea in their life. They don't know anything about cooking, and they're making tureens. And I studied with Ken Ferguson, and I couldn't have had a better teacher at the time, because this was a point in time when function was starting to ask some questions. We were moving into abstraction. The ceramic world was kind of making some moves. And Ken really talked about function, utility, the history of ceramics, made you go look at stuff, look at the objects themselves, not just books. This was a piece I made in the early 70s, maybe 72, 73, and the reason this is here is because of that little doodle. Okay, sometimes you have all the information you need at the very beginning, and it takes you 20 years to figure that out. You keep going outside of yourself and you come back in. This line is the history of my work. You'll see it in almost every piece in the gallery. Look for it. It's how I think about movement and rhythm of form. And it was there at the very first. I studied with Kryliki Solomon Hara in Alfred University. Kryliki came as a semester replacement for Bob Turner. So I was at Kansas City, then I went to Alfred. Alfred in 1975, I was there from 75 to 77. Alfred was a place where craft and art were like pounding heads in the mid-70s. I was one of 3 potters in the entire studio. Everybody else was making sculpture. And we'd have to put pictures on a table with a room of 40 or 50 people undergrads and grads, and you'd have to substantiate and stand up and say why it was valid to make a picture in the mid-'70s, because everybody else was making sculpture. So it built a backbone. But Kryliki didn't want any of it. She didn't want to talk about any of this. She wanted to talk about pots. So she just pretended she didn't speak English. Okay? And so she would just be quiet through the whole thing. And then when she came into your studio to work, to crit, she would put your pieces on a table, and then she would dance. So the critique was all through pantomime. Okay? So she had, if you had a real dumpy piece, she'd just kind of put all her weight down low. If you had a very elegant piece, she'd stand up and walk around. And through that kind of criticism of your work, she wasn't giving judgment. She was talking about how the figurative quality of the human stance is reflected in the object, and then what possible meaning can come from that. Now, this was a seed that started in the early 70s, the mid-'70s, and it's the seed I've been working on for my entire life. How does figurative form give meaning to an object? It resonates with our memories, our histories. A picture from Alfred Graduate School, and then this is one of the first pieces in the show. This is in the show. I left Alfred, decided a very kind of romantic vision, go out, set up a studio, make a living, okay? And this was actually something that people really thought they could do in the 70s, because there was a history of it. It was the arts and crafts movement of the mid to late 20th century, and it was possible. And had my first studio sale, hundreds of pieces, 4-day sale. I made $10. That wakes you up, let me tell you. But I was like in the game. I wanted to play the game, so I'm making pots and trying to figure this out. And in that moment, I kind of realized that if people weren't buying my work, I didn't have to really worry about what people wanted. There was a lot of freedom in rejection, okay? And you didn't have to like tailor your thinking process towards a perception of what the buying public wanted, because they weren't buying. So it actually let you go. So I started to go back to graduate school, if you will. I started to go back to ideas I had in graduate school, and just instead of thinking why would somebody want my piece, it was like, I don't care, I'll just make what I'm interested in making and see what happens. So this was Giorgio Morandi, and he had a show, wonderful Italian painter. He had a show in New York at the Guggenheim in '81. Went to see that and was blown away. And I was blown away, but not because, I loved the paintings, but what I really loved was how he dealt with space, how he dealt with the idea of positive space and negative space. Okay, and pots are all about that. Pots are all about, it's not just the space that they contain, it's not just the volume they contain, but it's the space around the object. Okay, they're the incredibly sculptural possibilities with utilitarian vessels. So I was looking at Morandi to try to get ideas, and out of that came a series of pots where really trying to generate energy in areas that there was no clay, versus trying to generate energy where there is clay. So spaces between, by the handle, spaces around the foot, spaces underneath the spout, that type of thing. So I started to do these mind games. There's a big tureen. I think this one's in the show. And again, if you look at the silhouette of this is the, it's that doodle on that pot that I showed from Kansas City. Now this is a Persian plate, and its decoration is actually a poem from the Quran. Okay? So this is a wonderful marriage, if you will, of kind of a decorative element, a formal element, and a spiritual element. So by reading around the plate, you get to the middle of the plate. And by using something functional, you get to a spiritual place. So it's this wonderful metaphor in there. And I was looking at all this stuff, and I was interested in how script would do this. This is a little line drawing, a little print from the Quran, that an artist did, and it's God the Almighty is beautiful and loves beauty. Again, a complete marriage of meaning and form in one object. And so I'm like really interested in this stuff, how objects give something other than what they are. They add something else to your life. They're kind of like a conduit into another world, and they're just the trigger. So I'm trying to figure out how to make pots, kind of where they're going. There's no roadmap here. You know, looking back, it's real easy, but when you're on the path, you never know you're on it. So I'm looking at nature, and, you know, just how things begin, how things end, and how I might incorporate that into a form. I'd do lots of drawings and doodles, and I'd fill my studio with drawings, and then I'd make a whole series of pots from the drawings. You know, so what this did is this I often describe it to students as trying to define the ball game you're playing, and then just play really inventively within those boundaries. So the drawings are the boundaries for then the studio investigation. In the southwest corner of the United States, from around 900 to 1200 AD, the Mimbres culture thrived and made incredible pots. Just beautiful, beautiful forms and beautiful drawings. And this is an example of one of them. Beautiful bowl. And I was doing a lot of reading at Mimbres on the time, and I found this schematic in one of these books. And the schematic is it basically breaks out the entire Mimbres culture through its iconography in 16 different variables. And so you could find any Mimbres pot in the world, go to any museum, and it'll fit somewhere on this chart. So think of that as a strategy of how to organize form. And I thought, oh my God, this is unbelievable. So what I did is I Xeroxed this page, put it on the wall, and then I'd take a dart and throw it at it. Okay? And wherever the dart landed gave me the strategy for how I'd decorate the next series of platters. So I'd make platters, and I'd make about 100 platters, 24, 26-inch platters, and just throw them and make bisque them and throw them and bisque them and have stacks of them. And that would be 2 or 3 months. Then I'd take the dart, throw it, and wherever it landed, I'd glaze decorate through finger wipe glazing 10 plates, because that's how I could get in my kiln. And then I'd fire the kiln, unload it, then throw the dart again. Okay? And what that did is it took away the whole construct of what's my work about, what am I making, and it gave me a problem to solve. And I've always used this technique throughout my career. I change the problem, and my work changes. So this is kind of the glazing process, and these are some series of pots of plates that came off the idea of thirds. Okay. So this is in the show, and that one's in the show. So these are all, breaking up the circle in thirds. And that's a studio shot from '82, I think. So it shows you kind of the thinking of, and kind of the chaos, if you will, of just making pots, firing kilns, making pots, firing kilns, and having the work really respond to the next work. So what I'm doing now is a response to what I just did last week, and what that was a response to the week before that. So everything is self-informative. It's all coming from its own generation. Now, in the early 80s, I was getting interested in geometry here. I was getting interested in how forms are organized and images organized. And my mother was born in Greece, or in Cairo, and during World War II came over to the States, and she stayed here, and the family went back to Cairo. So in the early 80s, we did kind of a go visit the family trip. And we spent about a month in Egypt going all around, visiting all our relatives and all old family friends and everything. And in that trip, we went down the Nile. So this is 1983. And we saw things like this, okay? So this is Valley of the Kings. And I'm looking at these columns, and I'm thinking of Mimbres pots, okay? In terms of how geometry is organizing form. And I'm looking at a pot like that, or not a capital, and I start to think of William Daley and how geometry, how this which is a solid object, which is describing the end point of a capital and the moment where weight is held through architecture. I'm looking at that and then see how Daly is taking that concept and putting it into a vessel. Okay, so the reason this is important is because it's linkage. It's like what the Egyptians were doing in 2000 BC has meaning and context for what I'm thinking about in 1982, you know. So that's really interesting to me, how these kind of cultures, the ideas in various cultures throughout history, you solve the problem differently, but the questions are the same, you know. So these are some sculptures, some big totems and lentil piece, you know, columns. The one on the right, the head, if you actually look at that, that's a cube. And it's the hair that takes you from one side of the cube to the other. So it's this beautiful subversive device to get you to move around a form. Okay. And then this little figure, this is carved on a column in Karnak. Okay, and it's only about 12 inches tall. And, you know, and all the stone carvers, they're all slaves. They're all, you know, this is what they did for their whole lives. And in this moment of that you know, that life, if you will, there's that belly button. And that is human. You know, that's a really subversive act. It goes outside of stylization and goes into, you know, this is about me living as a man, living in this world. You know, I mean, it's really interesting that you find these little moments in history where these things stick out. All around the tombs and everything, there were basically stone graveyards where they didn't know where the stones went. They were doing a lot of renovation and reconstruction. They didn't know where the rocks went. And so they pile them all up. There are hundreds of these. And I saw these as pots. Okay, so they're covered jars. So I come back and I start doing this. So I start taking the idea of the membrane, the idea of the geometry of the you know, the Egyptian stone carvers and the capitals, and I start drawing on pots on the round and then start folding. So these are the first ones. These are all about, you know, the jars are about that wide. There's a couple of them in the show. Vases, these are about 24 inches. You know, and then I had to figure out when you put a line on a round form and bend it, that line is no longer straight, it curves. So I had to figure out the language of marking. So I could kind of direct the mark based on how I put the line on the form. And so I do it through T-bowls. And so there's a group of T-bowls from the early 80s of just trying to figure out the new language I was trying to get towards. And that language had to do with how you touch things, how you hold things, kind of the sensuous quality of clay, and trying to bring that out. So looking at Aribe, Japan, 18th century, and then trying to take that, instead of copying it, how could I use the language of that form in another teapot form? Beautiful ewer, and then taking the construct of a ewer, a pouring pot, and trying to explore it sculpturally. And this is like, this starts to enter the ground of how form has meaning, and sexualized meaning. So it's like a male form versus a female form. How can you play with that? When do you go too far? When does it become parody? When is it like a joke? When is it really subtle and subversive? You know, so these are questions. You don't answer it in one pot. You answer it in 50 pots. Teapot drawings in the mid-'80s, 86, 87. Series of teapots from the studio. You know, I always work in series. I've never been a potter who can make 6 of this and 6 of that and 6 of that. I make teapots for 6 months. It's not a good marketing plan, but it works. You know? So you make all these teapots. Then you fire them and you see what comes out of it. Some of these are in the show. Okay, and on the piece on the left, there's, you know, looking at history, there's all these devices in ceramic decoration and form that you can borrow to solve formal issues in your work. Like, how do you get an eye to move around a form? So it's not just frontal. It gets you to want to look at the back. You can't understand the back by looking at the front. You have to move your eye, you have to walk around. So the petal form and the stem on this, where it starts right under the handle, then drops down under the spout, then on the other side it loops back around, that's a design device to pull your eye 360 degrees. So think of it as just really simple 2D design. And then how can you take that as a construct and then decorate a teapot, fold a teapot, create, you know, these forms that fold and move on each other and still have your eye move. So this is a good example of kind of that thinking in that form. Another teapot form, or the idea of, you know, like expressing this, okay? You know? And, you know, I don't care what anybody says, this is about life, okay? Okay, now I use a lot of geometry in my work, and I use a lot of the golden ratio. So this is a little lesson here for those who've forgotten. Okay, you start with a square, you bisect a line, then you do the diagonal, okay? Then you extend the base, and the diagonal becomes the radius. So then you put a circle around it. And where the circle crosses the bottom line, you then build a wall and add a rectangle. And that is a golden rectangle, okay? Now that relationship is called phi in geometry, and it's ratio of 1 to 1.618. Okay, so this is like kind of a big thing. And if you've heard of the Fibonacci series, Fibonacci is where you take the numbers and add them to the previous one, you get another one, and you keep moving. So like 1 plus 0 is 1, 1 plus 1 is 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, 5 plus 3 is 8. Every time you do that, you divide the higher number into the smaller, and you get a relationship of 1 to 1.618. Okay? And Leonardo did this in all his work. Okay? This was an aesthetic construct that he used in everything. But why? It's because it's in our body. So your whole body is organized like this, and the whole construct of a culture of how we see beauty in many ways is by how clearly proportioned you are in relationship to this equation from a cultural place, not necessarily individual. And so your hand, your digits of your fingers, your face to your chest to your neck, your torso to your legs, you know, your kneecap in relation to your upper thigh to your body. These are all in relationships of 1 to 1.618. And what's really interesting is that the DNA molecule, which makes up all of this, its width and length is also 1 to 1.618, you know, when they lay it out. So it's on a microscopic level as well. So it's macro and micro within our body. Now, if you go down in space when you have your rectangle, and you keep going down, you're creating golden rectangles moving down into the space. But you can also go out. So you're just adding squares, and you're going out. Okay. Now, when you connect all that, you get the golden curve, the golden spiral. Okay. Now, you know this in nature through shells. Shell structures are always done through this. Human ears is a perfect golden spiral, and how you hear octave is a golden spiral. So A, B, C, D, E, you know, all the chords are all an octave higher, and it's where it falls on the spiral. So you go all the way around, and the next one is there, and you go all the way around, the pitch is higher, and it's there. So this is like it's in our body. It's also in the iPhone. Okay, so to bring it back into the real world, Johnny Ives, who designs for Apple, everything he designs is based on a golden rectangle and spiral. Okay, so that's how the iPhones are organized. The Apple logo, it's all golden spirals, the geometry based together, and it's just little snippets of it. So the circle is curved, and that's the bite out of the apple. Okay, so this is like it's like beautiful. It's in everything. iCloud icon is all the relationships of 1 to 1.6 in different scales moving up. If you tweet, the Twitter feed, It's laid out as a golden spiral. Okay. Now, back to surfing. Okay. Okay, a wave is a golden spiral. Okay, so if you've ever surfed, you are riding that energy of the curve. So that energy is in your body. I'm convinced that's how I respond to work, is that I understand the energy of that curve from a body memory place, not an intellectual place. It's felt, it's not intellect. And it comes from years of riding waves. I haven't surfed in years, but in my early years, I surfed for about 15 years before I did. Okay, now take that, and the curve of this AMOCA pot is a golden spiral. Okay, so it's in ceramic history, it's in all this stuff. So this is an underlying structure of how form is organized, how it's decorated, how pattern is put on objects, and this is stuff I think about. Not everybody thinks about this stuff. This is what I think about, okay? So this is how I see the world. I'm always trying to understand how things are organized from kind of what you don't see and try to figure it out. And that's what influences my work. So when I'm looking at a pot, I don't look at the pot and say, oh, that's really cool, I'm going to make that pot. I try to figure out how that pot's organized. And if it's something that speaks to me, then I borrow that organization and I put it into one of my forms. This is a Tara figure from northern India, 10th century. And I love this work. I look at this stuff all the time, these sculptural figures. And when my wife and I were in London a few years back, I saw this in a little show in a gallery. And it's a drawing of a Tara figure, but it's with its geometry. Wow. Okay? So every one of those you see is organized very, very literally from a sense of geometric proportion of one move to another, how the face is tilted in relationship to the height of the knee. Okay, these are not subtle, these are not things that just are by chance, these are thought out abstractions. Okay, so this is kind of how this is organized. Okay, so it's all golden rectangles organized around each other. A Greek helix cup, a wine cup, and that's the organization of that. So this is in a lot of stuff in our world, and this is what I respond to. Okay, this is one of my pots, and then this is how it's organized. So it's taking golden rectangles, sliding them in and out of each other, stacking them. Okay. Now you could take a rectangle, or you could take a circle and a square, and begin to rotate that square on the circle and move up in space. So instead of it being flat, it's now dimensional. And you know that in architecture by that. Okay? And this is a very powerful sense of organization. And on the left, you've got the Great Mosque in Iraq. And what's beautiful about this is as you spiral and you move up in space, you're moving from the secular world to the spiritual world. So the spiral is a metaphor for how you get from everyday thinking, everyday life, to touching God. Okay, and the Madonna figure on the right, which is in the convent in Alcobaça, Portugal, the same thing. It starts at the feet, and through this wonderful movement of the robe and the twist of the body, you're spiraling up and you end up in the eyes, and the eyes are the gaze of God. So two different religious experiences using the spiral as a way to transcend from the secular to the spiritual, using design to get you there. So this stuff trips me out. I love it. Okay, and so I go, okay, well, how can you use the spiral in a form? So you just change alignment. So these are a whole series of vases. They're about 2.5, 3 feet tall, where if you look down on them, they're spiraling down to the base. A Chinese gourd, okay, a large intestine, okay, one's macro, one's micro. Same language, same form, and then how can you use that? You know, so drawings to kind of explore that sense of rhythm of the line and the gesture of that geometry and that organic sensibility, and then a series of vases coming out of that. So what happens here is all of a sudden symmetry goes to hell. So I'm a wheel thrower. So all of a sudden I have to hand build. I can't wheel throw anymore. So I have to figure out how to hand build, because I'm not basing my center on the center of the circle. I'm now moving it all the time. So process is now directed by idea rather than the other way around. So this is a series of these vases. These are like 87, I think. Okay, and this is right in a period when my father was in the hospital, and I would visit him in the hospital, and it was very difficult, and so I was looking at a lot of medical stuff, and so hearts and organs, and I was looking at the internal organization of the body, not the external, because I was around it all the time, and it would come up in my glazes, it would come up in my forms, and so it was real life affecting kind of how I saw my world, okay, and how I was managing it. And my father died in '87, and so I went through about a year of real intense grief. It was, it's the first time you lose a parent is really difficult. And in that time, it was kind of like trying to find yourself again. Why do you make things? Why do you care? It's like you just lost one of the most important people in your world, And in '88, I went to Lisbon. And I went there with a group of artists to teach for six weeks and to make work, to travel the country. And Lisbon in '88 was just rich with life. So it was like a rebirth. It was like, going down into the pit of grief and then coming back up and listening to fado and dance and music and great food and this culture that you knew nothing about, and everything was alive. And we're making all this work. And I fall in love with my wife, and we move forward, and life begins again. And I talk about this stuff because this is real in how you make work, how you respond. Why did you make that pot and not that pot? Well, this is why. I went through grief, and I came out. This is real stuff. And pots and making art is all about this stuff. Few people talk about it, but it really is about this stuff. So working on these kind of vases, these kind of cartoony, joyous vases, and looking at chaos theory and looking at fluid dynamics and trying to ask yourself, how does air move from one ventricle to another and express itself in the transition from that one space to the next space? And how does that create gesture? And through gesture, meaning. But it all starts with how air moves through an orb, through a ventricle. Okay, so I was looking at fluid dynamics, which is viscous liquid moving through kind of constricted space, and how it back eddies on itself. We know this as like looking at a river and there's a bunch of rocks in it. How the water hits the rock and back eddies around it. So these are a series of vases that came out of that. And then looking at comic books. So it's like, it's just a world of stuff out there. So my work there was also a humorous aspect to it. And in that humor, there was seriousness. So I was looking at comic books, I was looking at kind of the animated quality of human form and how that expresses content. Okay, and there's nothing better to look at than Zap Comics to get that. Okay, and I was also looking at the more formal, which is Martha Graham. And dance, and how does the body move in space and express energy and excitement and form. So playing the two against each other. So out of that comes teapot drawings. These are just monoprints, ink on glass, rubbing through, and then teapots that came out of that. So this is the early '90s. The concept of a teapot at that time was, what is a teapot? Okay, this is American Ceramics, 1990. These were the questions that were being asked if you made pots. It was a total question about the context of the utilitarian object and how you might abstract it. So I took teapots, and tried to play with that. So do you need a lid? Do you need an entrance? Do you need an exit? What is the spout? What is the volume that holds the liquid? Does it matter if there is liquid? You know, these are all kind of rhetorical questions, but you have to answer them in this piece, then you change the question and answer it in this piece. So this is a whole series from there. And then this gets like 1983. I spent 3 years making teapots. That's the only thing I made. And so it's 1993, and now architecture begins to become influential. And the reason it does is because everything's soft. My work, all the moments are soft in it. And after a while, after 3 years of it, it was like, you know, I need a little edge here. Yeah, give me some edge. Now you notice, I'm talking about formal things, and how formal things kind of come back in and affect outcome for ideas. How you figure out an idea. So I'm looking at a lot of architecture, and we all know this building, and it's just a whole series of golden rectangles. The whole thing is golden rectangles. But I was also looking at Gaudí, and my wife and I went to Barcelona for a sabbatical, and we traveled around Europe a lot, and I was really enamored by his ability to define architectural space through the hard and soft moves, and how they could be all in the same move. So it was a marriage of that. So that really affected how I thought of things. A little later, I was looking at Frank Gehry, and I was also looking at indigenous architecture. This is kind of an Islamic. I think this is Northern Africa, and again, it's a combination of curves and angles. So you put a curve next to a sharp edge, and what do you get? So you're in this point, you're trying to figure this stuff out. And as the work gets more abstract, I've always wanted to bring it back to pottery. I wanted to bring it back to the concept that the interior of the object is important. And if you think about it, pottery is the only art form throughout the history of man where volume is the central conversation. It's a central focus. And then there's all these different responses to it. But basically, the inside is really important. So this culture, the mochi culture of Peru, was one of the only cultures I've really looked where they were able to take pure sculptural form and simply by putting a stirrup handle on it, give access to that center space and make it a pot, not a sculpture. Okay? And so they did this with, they could make buildings, animals, figures, landscapes, everything. And you just put a stirrup handle on it, and now it goes back to a pot. So I borrowed that device. I thought, man, this is genius. So I took that and then started to make these forms, okay, and then put stirrup handles on it. So it was like borrowing a historical reference to bring context back to the pots, to make the inside important, so that you realize that this was not a solid object, there's air inside. And so these are a series that came out of that. Okay, and then you take the stirrup off, and now you put a spout and handle on, and they transform back into teapots. And then you take the spout and handle off and put a neck on it, now it's a vase. So it's, the pots are constantly recontextualizing themselves. So if I needed a new idea, I just changed what I had and kind of morphed it into the next form. And again, I say this because it's like, I've worked with so many students who hit a wall, and they go, well, where do I go next? And it's like, it's right there. Just change one thing, and everything will change. You know, you don't have to reinvent the wheel in your work. You just have to make the next step. And the next step's sitting right in front of you. So in 95, I went to Fayal. I was in the Azores, and I was invited to be part of a big conference. It's 25 artists from around the world invited to go to this island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And again, this is pre-internet. All, you know, 95. I don't think there was even email that we had accessible to then. And they gave us a whole a defunct military facility for studios. So we had these huge buildings to make whatever we wanted to, and they gave us the works department for the island, the city works, the builders, you know, everybody who repaired things. And they were our helpers. And so we could say, well, you know, I need a tree cut down. I want to make something, and they'd cut it down a tree, and then you could make. The sculptors were in heaven. But I get off the plane, and as I'm being led to the hotel, they tell me they don't have any clay, and they. I mean, these are like painters, sculptors, printmakers, musicians, dancers, writers, art critics, and a potter without clay, and there's no place to get clay. And there's no art store on the island, so it's not like, okay, well, I'll paint. There's no paper. So what do? You know, others besides drink, okay? So what you do is what I did is I just hired a taxi and went around the island and just kind of sulked and tried to figure out how I could respond to this island and make a body of work that would then, I forgot to say this, they're doing a huge catalog, and everything made would then go to Lisbon, to Prague, to Madrid, and London for exhibition. So this is kind of a big deal, and it's a volcanic island. It's in the middle of the ocean. There's all this language. It's just ripe for use. If you could just have some damn clay to use, but they didn't have any. But they did have this volcano at the end of the island. And it's Volcão dos Capelinhos in 1956, so it's very new, and it just rose out of the water one day and added about a mile of land to the island. Okay, and it's absolutely pristine curve. It's like sitting inside of a membrane pot. So I spent a day sitting inside there and looking at this, and then I realized, well, they don't have clay, but they have basalt. So I went to the quarries and got big chunks of basalt, and then I made lava pots and just carved pots. So did a whole series of these. And so what happened here, and again, this is ceramics 101. It was like, make something with one wall, make it from an additive process, and then here's a chunk of clay, carve something, and take stuff away, and now make it something from a subtractive process. So this is subtractive, and everything I've been doing up until this point was additive. So just that one thing changes everything. So I get back and I start building double-walled pots. So the inside is not the same wall and not the same definition of form as the outside. Okay? So these start out small. This piece is in the show. And they start to get bigger. That piece is in the show. And doing charcoal drawings, trying to understand curves and lines and squares and bricks and, kind of organic form against kind of industrial form. They started, this is about 2.5 feet maybe. And what starts to happen is a radical shift in how one identifies touch to an object. Okay, so up until this point, if you make pots, this is your relationship to the object. Okay, so you can go around any of these rooms, and if it's a pot and it's of a certain scale, the relationship is from your hand to holding the object. You can pick it up, you can move it over there, you can put it on the shelf, you can take it down. It's a relationship of authority, and it's built into the construct of the pot. It's built into the conversation. You don't even question it. You pick it up, you go, oh, that's a little heavy. You put that one down, you pick another one up, and you go, oh, that feels about right, I'll buy that one. Okay, but that conversation comes from how you experience your hand to the object, and it's through this act of lifting. Okay, now there's another way to get to this. And as I was making those pieces, because the scale started to shift, I started to go towards this, which was understand the object just by doing this. Not through the act of lifting or moving, because they're too heavy, they're too big, you can't do it. So your relationship is now to your body in relation to the pot or the object, not your hand. So a very simple thing, but it's a radical shift in how you approach your work. So what started to happen is scale shifted. Now this is an Ocotillo bush plant in southeastern Arizona, and that's the scale of it. Okay, so we understand scale through our body. That's how we perceive scale. So with pots, you perceive it through your hand. If you say, oh, that's a big bowl, it's a big bowl in relation to your hand, it's a very small bowl in relation to a volcano, okay? So it's to your body that you're doing this. So I started to ask the question of if I change the shift from hand to body, what happens? And what happens is everything. Okay, so there's a couple of these and some small ones of these in the show, but the work got bigger. And everything's double walled, so there's interior walls that are moving and are separate from the exterior. So outside flows inside, and just the whole sense of sculptural form shifted, and how you connected to the form shifted. So now you meet the object as a person. You don't meet it as an object. Your whole conversation is how you identify your body to it. The scale of your body to it. So these are a group of these. That's some in the studio being built. This one is that one finished. Okay. And then some outside, so you can kind of. So now all of a sudden the dinner table isn't the scale shift. It is now the outside. So how does the where you place the object shift your conversation of scale and location with it? So these are all abstractions, but this is, if you make things, these are inherent in what you make. You may assume a lot of things in that, but once you question one of those assumptions, doors open to how you might change what you're making. So these are platters, and a whole series of platters came out of the big pots. These are taking the big pots, and those globes where you have a globe and the world is on the globe, and if you want to mimic that on paper, the globe is changed the shape when it's on paper because they basically cut it and lay it flat, and now you have a different shape, right? So this is taking the three-dimensional pots and laying them flat. So I was taking the language in the big pots and just saying, okay, I'm going to take that section and lay it flat as an image and see what I can do with that. I'm going to use a plate as a way to do that. So here's a series of these that came out of that idea. And then that's the footprint of a pot on a piece of plaster. Okay, and I was going, oh, that's kind of cool. Let's take the footprint and play with how we use that. And so the footprint started I was looking at insects and the idea of doublets. Two things work together. That's the geometry of a butterfly, by the way. And then putting them on plates. So again, the work is always informing the work. And I'm looking at the outside world to answer a question, but the inside world is all coming from the work. So these are about 26 inches, and they're all cone 11 reduction. And right about this time, I built a wood kiln. And so I'm firing this wood kiln in my studio, and these pots are coming out of it. And they're just kind of, I'm making smaller pots now in relation to the larger objects. And it was like, oh, I got invited to a teapot show, I'll make some teapots, that kind of thing. And taking the language from the larger, putting it back into the smaller. And then something started to happen. Things started to quiet down a little bit. Okay. And this is when kind of another shift kind of came to me. These are about 2.5 feet tall. So we were in Paris, we went to the Cluny Museum, and we saw these figures. And these figures are about 10 feet tall. And you all recognize this as the human figure. And you don't need the head, you don't need the arms, you don't need the legs, the feet, any of that. You need the gesture. And the gesture and the way that the drape move on that figure tells you the emotional stance of that person, the replication of that person. So this is like taking human form and really reducing it down to meaning without the cha-cha, okay? Now this is my brother David, and David and I were very close, and he got diagnosed with MS in maybe the year 2000. And he was 48 when he was diagnosed, and as the MS progressed, it progressed very quickly with him. And as it progressed, I would fly out to LA and I'd see him, and we'd have these conversations. And when you're sick, you have to let go of things. You have to shed, because you have to take care of yourself. So all of a sudden, you can't work anymore. All of a sudden, so that part of your life starts to go away. You can't see all the people you used to see because it's just too draining. So instead of seeing 20 friends, you see 4. And you build those relationships deeper. And you kind of say goodbye to the others. And this is what happens. And he and I had these conversations all the time about kind of getting down to the essence. How do you reduce the chatter to still live a full life with grace? Okay. And what came out of that for me was not just, the emotional experience of these conversations, but it was like, how do you reduce the information in your work to get down to the absolute essential of what you need to understand it without touching it that last time, or without adding that last coil of clay? Bring it down to the essential. And so these were very big moments of reflection of how you see yourself to the objects you make through a personal loss in your family. And so during this process, I'm trying to reduce things. And so I'm building bigger forms. This bowl's in the show, but just a very simple big bowl. Let it breathe. And don't do anything. Give it one little mark. Let the flame speak to it. I don't need to do anything to let that happen. And this pot, just let the flame and that wood ash define that wall and that volume. I just have to give it the place for it to do. This big bowl, this is about this tall. Let that gold really define that hip. Another vase form, necked form. It's about 2.5, 3 feet tall. And again, looking at nature, how the weathering process of granite, how you might use that as language in defining a shoulder of a form. So wood ash hits and then falls off, much like water does. And so this is 2005, and I had an exhibition that was supposed to happen in Philadelphia in November, and my brother dies. I lose him. And I'm like devastated. I'm back in that grief. And I had all this work in my studio ready for this show. And it was like, I'm canceling this. There's no way I can do this. And my wife, thank God, was able to sit with me. And it was like, no, you really have to honor him. You have to honor him. And so what I did is I decided the way through this was to create this exhibition that was really a memorial. And so I glazed everything white. Okay? So again, it's that conversation of taking the cha-cha out and just bringing it down to its existential self in a form and letting it breathe and letting it speak really quietly. So this is about going slow. This is not about, fast time. This is slow time. So out of this comes these pots for this exhibition. And this totally shifted everything I've been thinking about since. So that piece is about that tall. And then more work ready for other shows. So now you again, grief, you come out of it and you find life again. And out of that comes more work. And it comes, vigor and all the things that we love, So these are some studio shots of my studio and how I fire things. And then some pieces that came out following that period. So it's maybe about 2008, 2009, somewhere in there. And again, it's like, if you want a drip to fall 4 feet, you got to build a 5-foot pot. It's just, you got to do it. And then, how do you give that real estate to allow that viscosity to happen? So this is glaze stuff. This is pottery stuff, But to get something to move, you got to get it hot. And you've got to get it hot, you got to hold it there for a long time. So these are like cone 12 for 2 days, and drips just move. You know, and again, so it's really about just going down to the existential self and just very simple gestures giving meaning. And I'm interested in how people come to my work, kind of their memories and their experiences and how they connect. And I'm always astounded by how one person reacts in one way and another person reacts in another because their history is different. You know, and the pot is simply the trigger to get to that history. This is how this piece is organized. So it's just stacking a bunch of geometries based on the neck. This piece is in the show, a scale shot. And then these last few here. So again, that sense of the pregnant self, you know. And this is how we fire them. Okay. And then that's it coming out. And that's it finished. So these are from 2010 through the 13, maybe. And along with that, you know, I do a lot of drawing, so these are big charcoal drawings. There's a couple in the show. And I'm always moving back and forth because I find things in 2D that helps me understand 3D and vice versa. You know, I always think that's interesting. You know, the subtlety of this little fold, you know, how light affects it, you know. Two sides of the same pot. Now that piece, that's just same glaze. It's just in an onigami kiln, so one side got hit and the other didn't, and so you got that color change happening. But how it really shifts that form. So these are the point of this is that it's all, you know, trying to keep it as subtle as you can and as quiet as you can, and let the process kind of direct. And have a conversation in that with nature and with that process, and direct it enough where you kind of know what you're doing, but not where you kind of, you know, are dogmatic about what's happening. You know, these last pieces are platter series that I've been doing, and where these become kind of more like landscapes. You know, these last two pieces were ones I fired at Don Wright's kiln in January. It was his last firing. And I said, you know, like things come in decades. So in August, my wife and I were invited up to the Archie Bray Foundation, and so I spent a month working in the studios there, and something shifted. And this is like this is where we're going. This is what's coming next. And it's so simple. It's so weird. It's like up until now, everything started from a circle. Okay, so if you're a potter, that's kind of an assumption you begin with. You know, if you throw on the wheel, you're starting with a circle. So everything responds to that. So I said, okay, well, what if we start with an oval? Just elongate that circle. Now what happens? And it was like, oh my God. Everything shifts. And so these are 4 big pieces I was making over about a 3-week period. And so they start to grow. And what happens is a complete shift in form, in analogy. Everything starts to move. And you deal with the entrance differently, the exit differently. And by having to kind of come up with a new solution, you're asking new questions all the time. So I always use the formal to break through to the next phase, because it's through the formal that's problem solving. That's not it's not a place of subjective thinking. Okay, so it's just like, okay, instead of turning left, you got to go right. So now, what's down that road? Okay, so there's tremendous permission in it, and with permission, there's no judgment. So you can really move. So anyway, so this is where this work is going. And the next series, I mean, the next probably few years will be coming out of this kind of thinking. Okay, I'm just finishing up here. These are my assistants over the last 10 years, 15 years, and they help me do everything. And they come for a few years. I have an internship program, and they stay for 2 years, and I kick them out and then get new ones. And they help me with everything from building to shipping to glazing to the tile studio to the whole deal. And it really is a wonderful thing for both them and me. And it's not always easy, but it's really been a great ride with them. And I always include them because none of this stuff would be happening without them. And then lastly, a special thanks to my wife, Nancy. And I'm putting this in here because, again, this is something most people don't talk about. But you don't make art in a vacuum. And I'm going to run through some images of her work. She's a painter and a sculptor, works in clay. And when you're working, you need people to talk to you about your work. And Nancy and I have been having conversations about art and life for 25 years. And in these conversations come questions. And in these questions, they come back into the studio through circuitous routes. And I always tell students, make sure it doesn't matter who it is. It could be a teacher, a mentor, a partner, whatever. But find somebody you can talk to and that you trust. That'll tell you when you're kind of, you're giving a little bit of BS in your work, you're getting a little too comfortable, where you're not asking questions, you're relying on all the stuff. The work is actually becoming a parody of its past self. These are hard questions for an artist. Comfort is the dead zone. And it's really easy to get comfortable when you're good, when you got good facility, when you got good hand. So how do you keep pushing your work? And I think one of the keys to it is through conversation where somebody that you trust can really kind of lay it on. And I don't mean like a hard thing. It's just where really interesting questions come up, and those questions percolate and resonate, and they come out. They may come out a year later or 2 years later. Okay. So anyway, we've had this conversation, and it's been a very important part of my work over the years. So thank you.
I'd like to invite all of you to come into the exhibition and see the show, have a drink, and a snack. Thanks for coming.